Hey guys, it's on the line. 3 months since Mark Carney was elected. What has happened? What has he accomplished? And why it might get harder. Also, we're going to check in with our buddy Rob Shaw in BC. David Eby is saying things that would have gotten Danielle Smith kicked out of the country only 3 months ago. What's changed? This is On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Airbnb. If you've been following the pod the last few weeks, you're familiar by now with the fact that all the Airbnbs that could be converted into long-term homes account for only 0.6% of Canada's housing stock. And Canada can't solve a housing crisis with less than 1% of a solution. But did you know that 47% of Airbnb hosts in Canada report that income from hosting has helped them stay in their homes? Learn more about the critical role Airbnb plays in helping Canadians get by at Airbnb.ca/closerlook. Hey guys, great to have you here. I confess this one snuck up on me. This is July, as you well know, to state the obvious, and it gets harder and harder to come up with things to talk about in the summer, and guests get harder to book. Last week, I'm sitting on the dock, working hard. And I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to talk about next week? And then it occurred to me, today, the day I'm recording this, Monday, July 28th, is 3 months since our last federal election. What has happened in those 3 months? What has Mark Carney accomplished? What has changed in the country, and what's changing around the world? My friend John Wright is a veteran pollster. He's a go-to guy I talk to about the numbers, but also about the political trends, because he's been doing this for long enough that he understands that the numbers only tell part of the story. I wanted to talk with him about the first 3 months of Mark Carney as an elected prime minister, what's happening in the States, what the Europeans just announced, and what Doug Ford is up to in Ontario. Here is my interview with John Wright. Well, summer is fun. It's always fun to talk with my friend John Wright. He's a veteran pollster, and I caught him in July. Finding people to talk to in July is not as easy as it should be, but I knew John would not let me down on this one. I confess, John, this one almost slipped past me, where it's 3 months today when we're recording this on Monday, and it will air the next day, but it's 3 months today since our last federal election. Mark Carney winning, not a majority, but pretty close to it. And given the state of our politics right now, none of the parties are really in a hurry to challenge him. I just want to get your sense, not even necessarily based on any specific poll, but just kind of you've been watching politics for decades here. Where do you think we stand 3 months into Mark Carney's post-election tenure as prime minister?
Well, I think he's done an exceptional job managing expectations. I mean, his biggest file has been the United States and Trump, and I think he's, carefully managing that. There would be some who would criticize by saying, he came to the fore and said that he was going to be able to solve the trade issue. But goodness knows, any proper thinking individual in this country knows that Donald Trump, can't be managed per se, and you can't expect to solve something. Although we've seen the Europeans, fight to a tie pretty much with their 15% tariff, but being able to, get a deal with Trump. So I think people, will take everything that has been said with him winning and saying that his mantra was about dealing with Donald Trump and say he's done a good job. I mean, we're not falling off the edge of a cliff. He's opening up new channels to different parts of the world. But I think overall, Matt, let me do reference the polls for a moment. His own personal esteem among Canadians is up. His own brand is up significantly. If the Liberals were to run an election tomorrow, notwithstanding a campaign, they'd have a vastly superior majority government, probably, in the 194 range compared to where they are today. He's managed the premiers really well. And in fact, when you look at how he's been able to deal with the Europeans and to bring them on board, especially, when he went out to Kananaskis and brought in all the other trade partners, and then do a side deal with Mexico. I mean, This is a prime minister who, is in control. We haven't seen a lot of the rubber meet the road yet, but we do get a sense that there's momentum. He's saying the right things. He's moving things along. And I think, the majority of Canadians are with him so far.
I want to ask you, because one of the things I throw at you from time to time is explaining polls to me, because I was looking at a poll the other day and it was a weird one. And this was probably just a few days ago. And it showed, to your point a minute ago, that Mark Carney's approval ratings as prime minister are high. His personal approval ratings are high. Pierre Poilievre, conservative leader, his approval ratings are down. And those are, again, his personal approval ratings. And it was pretty ugly for the conservatives. It was Carney somewhere in the 50s and Poilievre somewhere in the 20s. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at the national horse race numbers, and, not that they matter in July, probably 3.5 years before the next election, but I just took a look at them. And they weren't that different than what we had in April. The Liberals were maybe up a point or two, but the Conservatives were at 41, which is kind of right where they were on election day here. When you look at numbers like that show you on the one hand, prime minister doing well, improving numbers for him, but the actual horse race numbers nationally not moving much. What the hell is a guy like me supposed to interpret from that?
Well, it takes me back to when Stephen Harper first won government. It was with the minority. And I think Canadians who have voted for Mark Carney, have basically said, look, we'll give you the keys to the car, but we won't let you own it yet. And so there are a lot of people in this country who may give him approval ratings, but they want to make sure that he is the one to lead the country. And there are still many who are doing that. Number two, I think it's very regionally based. When you take a look at it in Western Canada, not a lot has changed. And you have to remember then that in order to get a majority government in this country, it's usually been about 37%. But with the NDP having melted away, you've got this almost split group in the country where you've got the Conservatives on one side and the Liberals on the other, of which the age groups are swapped compared to what they used to be. So young people are still aggrieved in this society. They don't have jobs. They don't have homes. They're over on that side where the older Canadians are with the Liberals. What I take from that, Matt, is that we have only two major parties in this country. The others don't count. You could say the Bloc does in Quebec, but the Liberals are doing well there. And as a result, the numbers move up. So what that 37 normally is now has moved up to about a 42 or 43 in that range. And that's the reason it's so high, because it's split between the two different parties. I take it at this stage, again, where if you do the seat modeling, given where the Liberals are right now, it's a smashing majority government. So, either way, that's how I would interpret it right now. You're missing one major party, and that's the NDP. They just don't show up anywhere in this country. The Green and the People's Party just don't matter. The Bloc's down in Quebec, but it's the two parties who, in fact, have the spread. And if you're 3 or 4 points ahead of that conservative group, then you're still going to be winning.
You said something a minute ago, and I'm glad you said that, because I was going to bring it up anyway, and it's nicer for me when the guest floats the idea. You talked about rubber meeting the road, and we're 3 months into Mark Carney, and I made a personal commitment to myself 3 months ago on election night that I was going to give him 6 months, that I was going to see what this guy's got. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't vote for him, and I didn't want the Liberals to win again, because I don't think they deserved it, and I think it sends a bad message after the 10 years they put in to keep going. But the voters spoke, and it's my job to cover it, not to choose it. So I said, okay, whatever. I'll see what Carney's got. That's basically what I said. We're 3 months into this now, and I can say that there are things that I like about Mark Carney. I like his tone. I think he's clear-eyed about a lot of the issues that are facing us. I think he has brought some needed discipline and rigor to the tippy top of the federal government. I think everything he's saying so far on the big picture of government service delivery, efficiencies in government, the big picture fate of the Western Alliance stuff, I'm with him on all that. All of his public statements, I'm with him. And I know it's only been 3 months, but I'm waiting for something to happen. So we've had 3 months of talking about stuff, and I like the tone, but I'm kind of wondering, okay, are we going to do something now? Because without trying to dredge up ancient history, I think the problem Prime Minister's predecessor had, Justin Trudeau, was that he would talk and he would talk and he would talk, but not a lot happened. The government was way better at messaging and signaling than it was delivering. And I'm not convinced yet that Mark Carney isn't going to be the same or is going to be different. I have no idea. I think 3 months is not enough time for him to have had a chance to prove himself. But if you and I are having the same conversation 3 months from now, and it's been 6 months and nothing is happening, I think at a certain point, we got to start waving some red flags here.
Well, there are certain things that have happened, whether it be the carbon tax, which is being removed, capital gains tax that's being put off, bringing down, opening up trade barriers. I mean, that's a provincial issue, but I mean, they've moved on that, and a lot of rhetoric. You're right, but I suspect that where we're headed in this direction is probably into the fall, and the marker will be the budget. And the reason for a lot of this is that, I mean, what Mark Carney's managed to do using the Jeff Bezos meeting technique is take all the air out of the room and make everybody kind of willing partners to do exactly what you said, and that is, you know what, let's see where this goes. So Danielle Smith quiets down. She's got to deal with her own boisterous people in her backyard, but nonetheless, on the national stage, she seems to have, ratcheted back all of the rhetoric that she was using. The premiers seem to be singing from the same hymn book when they come out of meetings now about trade and other issues. So, he's managed to take the air out of the tires there. He's got, he's had to put people in place in his own PMO, in his own government. And he signaled where we're headed with this. And that is a significant reduction in the deficit. And the only way through that is significant reductions, not just in programs, but also in terms of people. And what's being set up for that is a budget. I think we're all, you and I as observers are going to say, okay, let's take a look here and find out what is the mechanism? How big is the deficit going to be? How much are we going to have to support those industries within the country, the aluminum and steel and the auto people? How are we going to get to the there, even with or without a Trump deal? So I suspect that once we get into about September, October, we'll see the tires that are going to hit the road. And we will have to deal, of course, not only with unions, but also, I mean, he's managed to take the air out of the Indigenous, Bill C-5 issue for now. But you can tell everything is being settled down and everybody is, in fact, in line waiting. And I guess I would suspect that it's going to be the economic outlook that happens in the fall with the budget, which is the plan. And I think we're all waiting for that, and we'll see what happens. But his first battles may, in fact, be with his own civil service. And let me add to that. I think the other thing, too, is that it's one thing to say, we're going to do this, as you and I would as a CEO, with our steepled fingers like this. and then to realize that there's a whole other world underneath you that says, no, I don't think so. And just, I don't think he's yet met the force of the civil servants, which I think already have put sand in the gears and are already deciding what they want to do. That's going to be the big battle.
Obviously, I can't name names here, but just recently I was talking with a senior federal official, just kind of doing a vibe check. And I had said, the problem isn't going to be your intentions. The problem is going to be the machinery of government, and whether it is able, willing, open to even considering some of what you guys are discussing here. I want to throw just a quick curveball at you here. And we're not changing the topic, I promise. We're still talking about Mark Carney and the new government.
That's okay. Yep.
But it's the summer. And one of the things I've been doing since the pandemic is I've been crunching my way through like door stopper sized biographies of US presidents. And I don't have a lot of time during most of the year to do heavy reading, but it's the summer and I've got the time, so I can pick up either a Kindle version or a physical version or even an audiobook version. And right now on audiobook, I've got the massive biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, published almost 20 years ago by Gene Edward Smith. And it is fantastic. And I'm just getting to the meat of it. So, where I am, we've just got to destroyers for bases, Lend-Lease, the Battle of Britain, all that stuff. So we're up to 1940 now. And it was interesting because that means in the last week or two, I've been doing the chapters about the Great Depression, the New Deal. Now we're up to bringing the draft back. And the reason Roosevelt was able to move so quickly on this stuff is because he convinced legislators and the American people that democracy was at stake, that the American way of life was in danger, and that the government needed to use its powers to move quickly. Can I just say that we spent 3 months ago and the month before that an election talking about how Canada was facing existential threats, that our way of life, our very sovereignty were under threat, and that this was an emergency election. The subsequent 3 months have not felt like a country under existential threat. And I don't disagree with you about the tone and talking with the premiers, but if Roosevelt had moved as quickly as Carney, you and I are likely having this conversation in German.
Well, I mean, others might say that because of Mark Carney and the way he's acted, that and also Greenland, the president has gone on to other things. I mean, you could make the argument that he's being very firm and he's, elbows up and the whole bit, that he's staved off, being constantly attacked by the president. The president's got his own issues to deal with right now, clearly, a lot more with Epstein files than with Canada.
Uh-huh.
Right. So, we're not the shiny object that we used to be. But one could argue that this is a very different country than it was 3 months ago. What you heard after the election campaign, and I'm not going by any polls, I'm just saying what you heard among the chattering classes and others was, isn't it nice to have an adult in the room?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and yes, he can go down to see the president, and he can talk to him. He can have a gathering of world leaders in Kananaskis and talk to them as if he's known them forever, which he has. He can bring some calm and direction to the economy, apparently. And so we have done that. So has one man done all of that? I think what he's managed to do is to, again, shape the mood of the country. Again, people are not as anxious as they were. Everybody kind of settles down. And as I said at the outset, the tariffs that have been leveled now, the 15% in Europe, and the agreement that has been made so far has given a sense of predictability. If you had to take a look at our country right now and compare where we were 3 months ago to where we are now, you have people in this country who have got what I call deliberative judgment. The public actually goes through this. You'll have 30% who think one way, 30% who think the other way, and then 40% in the middle are the ones you want to watch. And they are confronted with a new reality. They absorb it. They look around, they look for leadership and all that, and then they experience it a lot. And then they move forward with deliberative judgment. Okay, I can handle this. I think we're there. I think people have gone, you know what? We're not going to be the 51st state. We do have faith in a prime minister who's moving us ahead in the right direction. The world is not ending. I do have a bit of stability. We know that there's problems in certain sectors, but you know what? I'm not losing my house. I feel okay. There is or maybe I don't have a house and I don't feel okay, but there is a sense that things have calmed down, right? We're not in that existential threat phase. It's also a case that we're doing something about it. I mean, take a look and see where people are traveling, what kind of food they're buying, what kind of liquor they're buying, all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit like having the environmental crisis. I remember doing polling back in 1990, 91, 92, and 93 about the environment. And the big change in all of our issues back then was the blue box. That's when it was invented. And it was, I need to do something about this. I need to contribute to the betterment of the world. And so that blue box became existential for all of us. Imagine that. We came to the curb and put plastic bottles in it. Oh my goodness. But we felt better. We were making a big impact to it. Well, guess what? We go to the store, we buy things, we boycott, we go somewhere else. We say, no, we're not going back there. There's a deliberative judgment that's taken place in this country, and we're living not just with it, but through it. And I think that has mattered a whole lot in 3 months. And I think Mark Carney's brought us to that stage in many ways.
You were talking just a second ago about people are saying, hey, I'm not going to lose my house, or I feel better, or I don't have a house and I feel mad about that. I want to talk a little bit about that. And this is something I say tongue in cheek a little bit, or at least with some self-awareness. But I was joking with my colleagues at the line after I got back from Europe. I took 2 weeks in Europe with the family. That is almost a whole subgenre of Canadian journalism. Like Canadian goes to Europe, is impressed, and then comes back and is like, wow, things are better there. And one of the things I find fascinating, and I think you've touched on this, is the divide in Canadian society between feeling better the last 3 months and not feeling better, and maybe in some ways feeling worse. Where is that divide in terms of age? And I know that's a blunt instrument here, but like if you were to divide the country in half, and people over this age feel better about things, people below this age feel angrier. As you said, the conservatives have seen their vote base flip, where now they used to have a hard time accessing the young. Now the young are flocking to them. Where's the cutoff? Who is the young and the old in Canadian public opinion right now?
Well, 18 to 35 are going to be more angry because they don't have what they've expected they could have. A lot of that has to do with the employment situation. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they made the comment that when we came out of university in the 1980s, and that dates me, we had our elbows up right then because we were flooding into the marketplace with a baby, tail end of the baby boomer. Oh my God, you just take any job and work as much as you want. So in many ways, it's like that. It's a scarcity of jobs in some sense. And then we're dealing with the immigration issue, which is still subsiding in this country. But there's a lot of other expectations. I mean, you still can't get the down payment to buy a house. You still haven't got young people living outside of their parents' homes, a good proportion of that. And the cost of living is really, really significant. We haven't, managed to fight down that 20% increase in the supply chain that we had during COVID. I mean, just look at meat and some of those other things. So those are very, very real things. On the other hand, you're going to have people who are in 50 plus range. And when I mention these ages, let's say 60% of them, the other 30% can go between.
Oh, yeah, it's not absolute.
Right. But you've got people who are in the older age groups who are basically going, my future is tied to a more plentiful future. And yes, I still feel about issues about affordability, but I have my home, or I have my future, which in fact is far more laid out than someone who is younger. So I would argue that right now, if you're between the ages of 18 and 45, and if you're between the ages of 45 and 70, you kind of split to two sides, and then some flip back and forth. That would be where I would think the haves and the have-nots basically are nowadays.
And I'm going to guess, and like you tell me if the math would bear this out, but the deeper you are into either of those groups, so the younger you are in the younger group, or the older you are in the older group, probably the more prevalent the feelings become. Like the younger Canadians, like you talk about the 18 to 45s, probably what you're talking about here is felt more intensely by the 20s than the 40s.
Yeah, absolutely. And, with the advent of AI, which, if I talk to my son, who is a graduate of Dalhousie, interned at an AI company, now has a business consulting on that very thing. I mean, the sense of the dystopian nature of this workforce and its workplace within the next 2 years is palatable. Like it is really and what you see them working on and how quickly they can do things, Matt, with what the tools they have, they're at the front edge of this. They have all the advantages of knowing how to work these things, and their attitudes about the future are pretty dystopian, even though they're right on the front edge of that. Let me also throw in one other thing: is we haven't talked about Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah,
I mean the success.
I want to talk with you about someone else, but you go for it. Talk to me about Poilievre.
Well, I mean the success of Mark Carney is also in the fact that Pierre Poilievre is nowhere, not only on the scene, but his agenda is gone. I mean, the agenda was let's get rid of Trudeau, and let's get rid of carbon tax, and let's do all these things. The fact that he lost his seat and he's had to be running out in Alberta, the fact that he did his first interview since he was leader with the CBC, I think screams, desperation in many ways. And people would say, and again, I think there's been a really interesting shift. People would say, after the campaign, I didn't vote for him because he's a nasty piece of work. Other people would say, well, Carney won because he had Trump on his side and he had a better platform, things like that. I mean, Poilievre, in many ways, because of what Carney's done, is now fighting for a new agenda, which he doesn't have. He's brought back Jenny Byrne. He's going to face a leadership convention later on or early on next year. I don't know how he's going to reinvent himself to become the new opposition leader for a party. And on top of that, you're having Doug Ford's people now, supplant the convention period, putting their own convention on top of that in Ontario. I thought the premier, we could talk about Premier Ford to see, some people are speculating he'll run for leader, which is a tough job. Run for leader of the Conservative Party. Make no bones about it. The Ontario wing doesn't want Poilievre to be involved anymore. Like that, that's very, very clear. So I thought the contrast in two ways with Poilievre, with what's going on in our, politics nowadays, came in two circumstances. One, around the Calgary Stampede, when not a lot of people showed up to his own event for hamburgers, he was talking about freedom. Okay, so he's the William Wallace of the Conservatives, right? He's like they're pulling out the entrails and he's going, freedom. And the rest of us on the other side of the world are going, what are you talking about? All right, so where the votes are for the progressive conservative vote, they're all listening to something which is being chanted out west, which is kind of like, I don't get what you're talking about. The second thing was, I thought it was very instructive when the Crown was going after the leaders of the occupation. Convoy occupation. And the Crown said, look, we want 6 or 7 years for mischief. And rather than trumpeting, this is a judicial overreach. These are the issues that, we could, should be less than that because there are far more heinous crimes that are getting less time than that, all like going down that route. They said it was political vengeance. Like they actually tied the Crown to some conspiracy that the federal Liberals, in fact, were manipulating the Crown to come in with this and go after the convoy. And I think this is the problem that the Conservatives have. They're on an old bent. You and I used to joke about, young men in short pants who, would say something in a tweet or do something which was always politically motivated. I don't think there's an appetite for that anymore. I think that we've moved on from that age, and for the Conservatives to go that extra step and torque it by saying this is Mark Carney's Liberal government, or it's the Liberal government who in fact are, basically telling the Crown to do this, and we're against its political vengeance. Man, oh man, that smacks of what's happening in the United States, not in Canada. So I think that would be how some people receive it. And I just think that the Conservatives are still playing the old game when there's a new game in town and they don't have a new person to deal with it.
You mentioned Doug Ford a minute ago. It's funny because that's the guy I planned on asking you about, and I will admit it in a minute. But I want to respond to what you said there. I think the Conservatives, and I'm trying to say this fairly because I've talked with a bunch of them, and I've actually kind of picked their brains on this. We've had some conversations about this. I think that there's this delightful term that Jen uses, and she invented it years ago, and she was using it to describe the Trudeau Liberals, but I think it now applies a bit to the Conservatives. I try to keep the language cleaner on the line. We can get potty mouthed on the Line podcast, but on this podcast, we try to keep it a bit cleaner. I'm going to bend that rule here because I'm going to quote Jen. The term she invented was stun fucked. And I think a lot of the Conservatives I'm talking to are stun fucked. And they don't know, like they're looking back and forth between two bits of data. One of them is that they got the most votes and the highest percentage of the vote share that they've ever gotten as the modern iteration of the Conservative Party. And the other is that they lost. And they can't make sense of that yet. And maybe this is just part of a grieving process or whatever. But to what you were saying a minute ago about Poilievre having been out of the debate, right? Just you're right. And we brushed right past the Bloc and the NDP and the People's Party and the Greens, and I think correctly in the current political moment. But I have this very specific memory of Pierre Poilievre, and it was about 2 weeks into the election, so just over 3 months ago now. And Mark Carney was out there every day, and he was saying, we're here to defend Canada. We're here to defend Canada. We're going to defend Canadian values. We're going to stand up to Trump. We're going to protect Canadian sovereignty. And the Conservatives are like, let's talk the industrial carbon price. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, they don't get it. Like, reality has overwhelmed them. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. Like, this is something that can happen to any politician, right? We call it the bunker. They're in the bunker. They have staffs around them. All the information they're getting is being filtered through other people. Those other people have their own agendas. They want to kiss up to the boss. They're trying to spin the message. You can visibly see sometimes when a politician loses touch. And Poilievre lost touch. And I don't think yet the Conservatives have figured out what to do with that. To your point about the Ontario Conservatives, though, Poilievre got a ton of votes in Ontario, but he didn't win. And I don't know if they know yet what to do with that. Meanwhile, Doug Ford, guys won 3 majorities in Ontario as a Conservative. I'm not a fan of Doug Ford. I'm pretty much on the record on that one, but the guy knows how to win. And the only reason I think he's not actually out for Poilievre's job is because he'd rather be Premier of Ontario than Leader of the Opposition for 3 years.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that latter point. And I'm not sure. I mean, it used to be back in the old days that when Bill Davis was being touted as running for Prime Minister, it was Hugh Segal, Norman Atkins, and Ed Stewart who were actually manipulating and putting all the conditions in place and feeding all of that to allow Bill Davis to make the decision, which he decided not to go for it and resigned instead and opened it up for the next period of time. So there's lots of people around who can be doing this without the individual actually saying, like, I'm not going to stop you, but I'm not going to say one way or the other. I mean, if anything, Doug Ford could be uttering the same phrases of Bill Davis. It was, I have no plans to have plans. Like, I remember that very clearly. You know, I have no plans to have plans. I'm not planning to do anything. I have no plans except to govern the province.
That's what I say in the summer. I have no plans to have plans.
I have no plans to have no plans. Right. It was always funny because I did work. I mean, my disclosure, I worked for Hugh Segal, who ended up being Senator Hugh Segal. I worked for Hugh Segal for 6.5 years. And Huey used to write all the speeches for Bill Davis, even when I was there working with him. And they would go in and it would say, check against delivery. And I remember seeing the draft of the speech and going to these luncheons and having Davis say what he did in the room, which was basically to have fun with everybody and not to give anything in the speech. And then to get very serious for the last 2 minutes. And that was the headline. And, so Huey wrote about, 150,000 speeches that were never delivered because you always just checked against delivery. Yeah. So look, I think there's a couple of issues here. Number one, I think the Conservative Party is going to have to recognize that the wave came in and went all the way up to the shore. It didn't get all the way to the break wall, and it's gone out. Gone. Swept out to sea.
Yep.
Number two, putting Andrew Scheer in place might be a placeholder. Maybe it cuts on the ambitions of those who want to be leader or whatever. But Melissa Lantsman could have had that job, put a different kind of face on it. Maybe she'll have her time, Michael Chong, all those people. But we'll wait till the new year to see how all of that works out. But I think on the Doug Ford piece, I think he said the most important thing about 3 weeks ago. And he said, you can't win from the extremes. And that is true. In the province of Ontario, if you want to win the country, and if you want to win as a Conservative, you're going to have to take Ontario. You're going to have to take parts of Quebec. You're going to have the Maritimes, and you're going to have parts of British Columbia. But you've got to have, in many ways, without Trudeau there, which I'll finish on that in a second, you've got to have that pragmatic center. You can't have the William Wallace chirping from out west come to Ontario and expect you're going to get it. What you did have was a leader of the Liberal Party who only had 18% support. Mm-hmm. You had polling that I did last September and released in October that showed in the 4 major cities, you've heard me say this, that
we talked about it.
If given a chance, that voter pool opened up to 52% who said, yeah, I'd take another look, which said to me the Conservatives didn't own the vote. They owned the protest, but not the vote. And
Yeah.
as a result, when it switched, that's when you had it collapse. I think, again, I don't think there's been anything to make that coalition come back. And I would agree with your Jen, is that they're stunned because they're in the old way. They're in the old chapter. This is a brand new chapter, and they simply not only can't figure it out, but they're playing by the old playbook, and it's going to take a new playbook to deal with it. It's just not going to work.
One more question for you. One of the things we haven't talked much about, and it is, you mentioned the Europeans. Just yesterday, you and I were recording this on a Monday. It was just yesterday that the European Union and the United States announced a new reciprocal trade deal with 15% tariffs. The Europeans are unhappy about it, but I think they're willing to take it, right? Like it's something that will provide hopefully some stability. With Mr. Trump, stability is a relative term, but for now, at least, there should be some certainty. One of the things we haven't talked about much, and it could matter for Mark Carney, it could matter for Pierre Poilievre, it could matter for Doug Ford, it could matter for each and every one of us, is what happens when Trump's attention does come back to Canada. Because one of the things Mark Carney has had going for him now, and no judgment, this is just the way it worked, Canada hasn't really been top of mind. There have been global events going on. As you've mentioned, Mr. Trump has domestic political problems. The Epstein files are heating up. There's some cracks in the MAGA coalition. So Canada hasn't been top of mind right now. But every once in a while, Trump throws a barb our way. And I'm starting to see already water being poured into the wine of the provinces being willing to actually sacrifice to get actual free trade deals. They're all like, oh yeah, one economy, except, A, B, C, and D, right? They're starting to water that down. They're looking after their own little parochial, provincial, literally interests here. Mark Carney blinked and immediately rolled over on the digital services tax. I don't know if he cared. Maybe that was a bone he was happy to throw the president, but there was no resistance there. We're seeing some Canadian premiers. Paul Wells wrote about this just last week. I thought it was brilliant. David Eby out in BC is now starting to say the things that 3 months ago when Danielle Smith was saying them, we were ready to drive her out of the country. What happens when Trump actually puts Canada in the crosshairs again?
Well, you got to think that Canada is in the crosshairs maybe all the time, but that they're just distractions for the president. So the question is really, when is a distraction not enough? I think there's a couple of things that have changed even in the last week. Number one, you have the European deal. Mark Carney is incredibly connected to that community. He will understand the dynamics that it took to get that kind of a deal. And it's also precedent setting. I mean, it is a 15%, and it signals what he said about a week and a half ago. Maybe we're going to have to accept that there's going to be tariffs in the deal. And he said that before he went to see the premiers. And they were saying coming out of that meeting, maybe that's the case too. So you can see that the Europeans were working on it. Carney's connected to all of that. And it's basically, guys, we're going to have to, this is the way in which it looks to be. So maybe all of our sharpened pencils and, being in Washington and doing the hard work that we're doing as, busy beavers is just, at the end of the day, we're going to have to suck it up. And this is what's going to happen. So Japan gets tariffs. We get tariffs. Everybody gets tariffs. And then the president can then say tariffs work. Number two, you then have a circumstance where you can see that the United States is changing the very world and how it actually operates.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of the change that we have now. We have NATO, which is, pulling its own weight. It's even buying arms for Ukraine from the United States instead of being supplied. We have a rearranged trading relationship that the United States is having. We have manufacturing plants opening in the United States. We have the regulations cut so that, oil and gas and coal and everything are changing. I mean, damn the environment, we're just going to build. Donald Trump is changing the world. Like, he's making it incredibly entrepreneurial, but he's also putting America first. So you can argue with everything about immigration and how it's taking place in the United States, that there's even, he's got his own little he even has his own domestic army, which is now moving into different places. I mean, there are so many changes taking place, but from our point of view as a Canadian country, there are certain compromises we're going to have to make. What it has done is open us up to trading partners in other parts of the world that we're going to have to get really serious about. Mark Carney happens to have the relationships there where, in fact, we're starting to cut some deals and we're going in those places. If you take a look at the balance of trade in the last quarter, we were actually moving ahead further with other partners and trading our goods than we were with south of the border.
Yeah.
So back to your point with the book you're reading about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was the New Deal, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was the new relationship. It wasn't just we're going to go and liberate Europe and opening up a new era. But I remember there was Theodore Wright wrote a book after he wrote Thunder Out of China. He also then wrote a book about the whole aspect of the Second World War. And I can't remember the book because the book after that was America in Search of Itself. And I think it was called In Search of America. But there was a great moment in that where it's the last chapter and they're standing where he was on the deck of the ship when the Japanese are signing the surrender. And he said, as we were standing there, the air was filled with American planes that just came over top of them. And a little known fact was that when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, there was a flag that was flying close to one of the airfields. It was the tallest flag there. It was cut to ribbons. They actually mended it. And on top of that ship, at the signing of the surrender.
The Missouri, I think it was.
And he turns and he said, America was at its zenith. That was the moment. And from that point forward, America then declines. It's the decline of America. And you know that you can actually take certain eras and block them into parts. Mm-hmm. This is one of the most consequential times we ever have lived in with the United States, because they are not only, rewriting their domestic policies, whether it be education or whether it be immigration or all those pieces, but they're reorienting the entire world. And if at the end of the day, we have to live with 15% tariffs in order to live in that new reality and work our way into other countries, that's what we're going to do. And people are going to look and say, who's better equipped to do that, Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney? And that's your ballot question right there.
John Wright, veteran pollster. Good to talk with you, John. And I will see you later this week because we're having lunch. But in the meantime, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Always a pleasure, Matt. Take care.
That was John Wright, a veteran pollster. Coming up in moments, a regular contributor to us at The Line, a contributor all across the BC media, a reporter, a columnist, a hell of a good guy, Rob Shaw, joining us from BC's capital. We're going to talk with him in moments about what's happening with David Eby and why the elbows might be coming down a little bit. Stick around. My conversation with Rob Shaw is in moments. This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's Pettatanguishene in the 1860s. For generations, Métis families fished these waters. Métis grandparents taught grandkids to cast nets. Fathers packed crates bound for the trading post. Mothers salted the morning's catch. And the smell of lake water and wood smoke became deeply embedded in memories. Every summer, Métis boats carve routes through Georgian Bay with persistence. Their Métis traditions and trade became the commerce that built Canada. Today, while Canadian families head north to the cottage to play, remember those who paddled north to build, and know that Métis communities continued the traditions that built Canada. To learn more, visit OntarioMétisFacts.com. Rob Shaw, great to have him here on the line. Rob, I want to ask you a specific question. Before we get to it, I think we should probably just set things up a little bit first. This is maybe too big a question to be useful, but what's up in BC? And I know that's, I'll try to narrow that down a little bit for you here. British Columbia, since Mr. Trump was re-inaugurated in January, British Columbia and I think Premier Eby were in the lead in terms of kind of taking a strong Canadian tone. You and I talked, you wrote about it for us, about you get the mining, speeding up mining projects and resource projects. Big picture, Where are we now? Here we are at the end of July. Carney's been prime minister for 3 months. Where is BC?
Yeah, well, BC, I think, is still in the position that it was in the very beginning of the Trump administration's kind of threats, which is it's actually quietly, politically very advantageous for the provincial NDP government to be throwing haymakers at Donald Trump. It's a government that last November almost lost the election by 22 votes. They preserved their one-seat majority. They went into a transition to themselves because they had no idea what to do. And then Trump came along and has given the EB government focus and purpose and drive. And suddenly it's passing all this legislation about fast tracking projects. It has leaned into the mining sector. It has leaned into the LNG and natural gas production, which like previously it wouldn't even talk about. And so it's kind of created a little bit of a whiplash for voters who have they didn't elect this version of the NDP. They haven't seen this version of David Eby. And now he's kind of this big haymaker, swinging anti-Trump, Canadian flag, natural resource, job generating, business economy, task force kind of guy. And it's sort of fascinating to watch his evolution there.
What has it meant for his approval? Are NDP voters happy? Are they grumpy? Like, what's this actually doing for him politically? Because you said, I think you're right. I think politicians all over the world are seeing value in lining up against Donald Trump, but is it working?
Well, we've seen an Angus Reid, a poll that sort of indicated, as they called it, the Trump tariff kind of hangover effect, that when you remove the U.S. kind of tariff fight, you end up with a premier who is facing some really challenging approval numbers because of the healthcare system collapse in British Columbia, the wait times. We have public safety and continued addictions and involuntary care issues, and a whole massive debate out here on a whole bunch of stuff. Cost of living, we're still the most unaffordable place to live in the country. And those issues are still there. And the minute you remove Trump from them, you end up back with a public that's really unhappy about all those issues. And David Eby is no John Horgan. He does not necessarily really enjoy the popularity of John Horgan, but he enjoys it when he fights Donald Trump. And so that's the great political calculation here for his strategists, is the more that he can lean into that, the better his numbers look. And without it, this is a government that just keeps, that old Simpsons meme where Sideshow Bob has all the rakes around him and he just keeps, everywhere he steps, he gets a rake in the face. That's basically the NDP government this year on just a whole whack of issues, including and up to taking medication away from a dying 10-year-old girl and fighting that for the last few months, which no one could understand. So those domestic issues are just like, pits of despair for the NDP. But when you add in Trump, it doesn't look so bad.
Okay, obviously, I'm not making light of the sick young girl, but I'm going to be a little bit flippant here. Sure. That story was happening just as I was leaving on vacation. And I remember looking at that and I'm thinking, if this isn't fixed by the time I'm back, these guys are idiots. And it wasn't. They spent week after week. And just so the listeners know what we're talking about, there's a very young girl, I think you said 10 years old in BC, who has a horrible terminal condition. And there's a medication. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rob. It improves her quality of life. Like, it helps her manage symptoms. And the government just pulled it because they had like a medical report saying it wasn't going to be valuable here. I understand that medicine's expensive, but just as a general rule, if I'm advising politicians, don't take medicine from dying kids.
Yeah. It taught us something about the NDP government, which fits into the tariff conversation too. And that is this version of David Eby's government, which I think we can call version 3.0, because he had one when he was pre-election and one right after the election. And this one is one that does not back down easily. And it has used Donald Trump as a kind of like a catch-all to sort of say that it knows what to do. It needs the power to do it. People might be upset right now about what it needs to do, including First Nations chiefs who have been very upset at some of the government's legislation on fast tracking. But stay with us, and we will prove ourselves right over time. And that might play out maybe in a kind of longer term sort of tariff strategy. It does not play out on things like BC Ferries contracting with China to build these new ships. It does not play out on taking drugs away from a dying 10-year-old girl. It does not play out on a whole bunch of other domestic files. And that kind of clash between the new EB government and the kind of like stubbornness. I'm not sure stubborn. It's something. We're watching it to see sort of exactly what it is, because it doesn't match the political antenna that we thought that this government had, and that is a really worrying sign when everyone knows what it should do, and for months it doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Why? That's a troubling question.
So here we're really cross-pollinating all the trends, because obviously
Right.
you've seen the meme of the Coldplay debacle where an executive was having an affair apparently with a member of his staff. The reason I bring that up is just because a buddy of mine, Andrew Tumilty, he writes for The Line occasionally as well, and he works, his job is like crisis comms, and he was tweeting up a storm about this, where he's saying, what the company needs to understand is when you're in one of these untenable situations, the smart thing to do is figure out what is the best case scenario for us. How fast can we get there? And I was looking at the BC government fighting it out with the family of a terminally ill child. And I know this sounds very flippant because it's such a serious conversation, but I was wondering, Rob, who the hell is advising these people? Who's the person in the room going, no, we should continue to go out there in public and deny access to this expensive medication to the terminally ill kid? Rob, I have no idea if this medication is working. Like, I don't know if it is doing what it's supposed to do. I do know any government that is ripping meds from a dying 10-year-old is going to pay a political price for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it took the combined might of the world's experts on this drug, 13 signatories on a letter from across the United States and the major researchers across the world, including the author of the clinical scale the government was using to withdraw the drugs in Germany, combining together to write a letter to the premier saying, you've got it wrong, before finally he kind of went, oh, I guess we do have it wrong. And the problem that they really had, and governments get like this at a certain age, and we're 8 years into this government, is that it crafted itself a box it couldn't get out of from the beginning. And that was a snap judgment to say, why don't we play this as science versus politics? Why don't we play it as, do you want me as a politician deciding who gets drugs? Look at Donald Trump. He does that. We're never going to be like that. And then they box themselves in and they took away the only leeway they had, which is in an ultra rare case where the science isn't settled and people look to the politicians to make leadership decisions, and you can't do it because you've taken that option off the table. And we watch the EB government do that on other issues too, where its very first take can be very aggressive and it becomes difficult to back down from. And you see that in later stage governments, unfortunately, as they kind of decline. There's too much criticism. There's too many critics. The issues are too big. The baggage is too heavy. The path is too complex. They need quick, short wins. And they substitute action for communications and for aggressive kind of sound bites. And it usually is the path to ruin eventually.
And this isn't BC specific, right? Like, there's versions of this everywhere, but you can tell sometimes when the politicians are overly wedded to the version of it they came up in the cabinet room or the strategy meeting. And then, like, you know, the old maxim, right? Like, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And they go out there and they're getting absolutely killed out there and they're sticking to it. I want to ask you, because you've mentioned it already, on the public safety front, you've written about this a lot, especially ahead of and during the last election. The EB government was forced by public opinion and I think reality to retreat on issues like public safety, mandatory treatment, things like that. Where are we on that one? Because I've been saying this for weeks. I'm sure the listeners are tired of hearing about this. I just came back from Europe. I remember, I'm not so old that I have forgotten when Canada and Canadians were like, well, Europe is beautiful, it has great food, it has old monuments, but our cities are safer and cleaner. I got to tell you, man, I was in 7 European cities over the last month. Canada don't look so good compared to Europe these days. What's going on in BC on this front? Like, was that all election rhetoric, or are we actually seeing changes?
It's tough because last week there was new Statistics Canada numbers that came out that said overall BC's crime rate and severe crime rate has gone down. And we saw the NDP government kind of take that out for a victory lap, saying, look at all the things we've done, and this is a direct result of it. And they faced a kind of immediate blowback from people who were like, I don't feel safer. I don't. There was a 32-year-old mother of 2 in Kelowna who was beaten to death in broad daylight in the middle of the day in a parking lot by an ex-husband, allegedly with a hammer. people don't feel that statistical safety that Stats Canada did. And that was a disconnect from the EB government there, trying to take credit for something people don't feel. And we see it again in BC. There was Nanaimo City Hall the other day proposing to put a gigantic fence up around its own city hall so politicians could feel safer because there's a supervised consumption site right next door and all their cars are getting vandalized and they're getting harassed on the way into council chambers. They ultimately voted it down because it was too controversial. But I mean, the problem that this government has now is that there are no easy solutions to the major problems it is facing. And the solutions may take years. And even its response to Trump's tariffs, which is grow the economy, lean into new mines, fast track new permits, though it still takes 10 years to build a new mine. They maybe can get it down to 4. That's a whole term of the government. When do you see the results of that? When do you see the results of involuntary care, which is a complex subject? They're having to build buildings. When do you see the results of bail reform from Ottawa that they continue to push? When do you see the results of opening a new med school to train new doctors to keep ERs from closing? It takes time, and they're stuck at a point in government where the public isn't giving them that time. So the real risk is that they pretend to see progress on issues that the public doesn't feel. And that is the crime issue, I think, in a nutshell. There's no one in this province in the real world who would argue the downtown east side in Vancouver or Pandora Avenue in Victoria is better, even though the Stats Canada numbers say severe crime is down in both of those areas, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
I feel like I keep trying to not seem like a terrible person because I keep prefacing I'm not trying to make light of something. But like I mentioned, I just got back from overseas, and one of the first stories I read when I got here was StatCan shows like major crime indicators down. And where I live in Toronto, we have not had a ton of violent crime, but what we've been having is car theft. And my local community Facebook page has basically become like a police blotter. Like it's just crazy guy screaming at the supermarket or guy in the park pissing everywhere. Like this is a nice upper middle class neighborhood. And I'm reading the StatCan report saying auto thefts are down in the GTA by 25%. And the politicians are like lauding, hey, we've done a great job. Look at all of our initiatives here. And then I'm reading in the community group that a woman had her Lexus stolen from her driveway on the first night it was in the driveway. And she was asking people for security camera footage here. It's not that I'm rejecting the stats, but the stats have to at least sort of align with what people are experiencing, or else the politicians are going to get in trouble.
Well, and the quick comeback to the stats is that from critics that people aren't reporting it anymore. And you do see this, when you talk to business owners who repeatedly get their shops smashed and they just stop reporting it because the police can't do anything. I was in the dollar store yesterday where a gentleman in distress just started grabbing items and throwing them into a bag. And you hear from business owners, they don't stop people, right? It's not like you're going to tackle someone who's in the middle of an addictions crisis and try to get your belongings back. You don't even phone the police because they're not going to come. So the statistics may be out of whack because of that. But I think we're reaching, and we saw it kind of with addictions too, at a kind of a boiling point where people are willing to try new things and they're willing to give politicians some leeway, but they quietly begin to seethe about what they see. And it is not okay to step over someone who is having an addictions crisis in the middle of the street in downtown Victoria. It is not okay to have your business repeatedly vandalized or to have your car repeatedly broken into or your items shoplifted. And you, for a while, put up with it. And for a little bit, you complain about it and you grumble and you ask, and then you reach a just kind of like, I'm done, I'm fed up with it moment. And I think that's where we've headed on addictions and drug policy in BC, and where we're sort of heading on crime as well.
Are there any issues right now other than Trump? And I'm going to exclude him because I want to talk about him in a minute. Are there any issues these days for EB that he's doing well on? Like when he wants to change the channel, it's not going to be, hey, we restored drugs to the sick kid. It's not going to be, look how safe the streets are. What is he trying to do and what's he trying to talk about? Because I want to echo something you said. This is a guy who had shown some real political acumen in recent months. He had shown some good political instincts. Every story I've read, including yours out of BC in the last 2 or 3 months, has been EB, as you said, stepping on a rake.
Mm-hmm. He's leaning into clean energy with an enormous multi-billion-dollar investment in wind and solar power, which I think is what some people want to see. He's trying to electrify and expand capacity for industry so that when they bring on new projects, they can use electricity instead of pollutants. He's making kind of movements in that area. Some of his housing policies, which initially seemed incredibly ambitious, have kind of cooled a little bit with the housing market. So he's wearing some of those. His short-term rental restrictions, people are paying through the nose for hotels in Victoria and Vancouver because all the Airbnbs have dried up. So he's moving his government in a way where what used to be the benchmarks of the NDP, environmental protections, for example, are now being policies rewritten by government. Clean BC and environmental kind of standards are being put aside towards economic development. So his successes come by reversing his policies previously to reflect a new reality, which makes your successes come with a lot of criticism as well, because you got different validators. And that's a fascinating thing. When you anger First Nations chiefs, when you anger environmental groups, but the business community is behind you and natural resource companies are behind you, you have a different metric of success. And that is tough for New Democrats who used to think success was getting eco-justice and the BC First Nations Leadership Council validating their announcements. And now they're fighting those groups.
You'd written about that for The Line just probably about a month ago now, because I have no sense of time during the summer. When my kids aren't in school, nothing angers me. I don't even know what day of the week it is.
It's a flat circle.
Yeah, exactly. But you'd been writing about how a lot of the groups, you specifically underlined the Indigenous groups in BC, are now looking at EB and his government and going, what the hell? Like, it's just been a complete about face here. What I'm wondering, and you talked a bit about the polls, the Angus Reid poll, I think voters are pragmatic. I think voters in general are less ideological than the politicians. I think that's a statement of the obvious. And I think voters are forgiving. If they see a politician forced into a change by circumstances and events, I think voters get that. But only to a point. They're only like, they'll bend a while, but eventually they're going to break here. I don't know if the BC NDP voters really bought in on becoming conservatives.
Well, that's true. I think it is fascinating to kind of watch the slow embrace of some of the conservative positions. EV mandates, for example. The government now is clearly going to alter its EV mandates, whereas before it mocked the conservatives for suggesting that we couldn't hit those targets and not everyone wants to buy an electric vehicle. The same with the carbon tax. From a baloney factory, last man in Canada to defend it, David Eby, to we got to get rid of it. And so it's either an embracing of conservative positions, which I don't think it is, or it's a recognition that the government drifted too far off of public sentiment and didn't quite grasp that its positions were needed to be moderated slightly. Yep. And that continues to happen all over the place. And not just in, Ontario is facing the same First Nations backlash that BC is facing on fast tracking projects. So they're not alone in that fight.
I remember Rob saying to Jen a couple of months ago that if you just jotted down point form notes of party platforms, I don't know if I would get more than 50 or 60% accuracy on trying to align those point form notes to the parties. Things are weird these days. There are federal conservatives saying things that to me sound like liberals, federal liberals saying things that sound like conservatives. Doug Ford in Ontario saying, kind of covering every party's agenda. We're just in a weird time here. And I don't know if we should put this in highfalutin terms. Oh, it's a grand political realignment, or if these guys are just scrambling.
Yeah, I think, in BC, the election platform from the BC NDP is useless. Like from November or October, you might as well just set it on fire. It has no value whatsoever to the current debate. The New Democrats aren't doing anything in it. Their marquee portion of it, $1,000 rebate to every British Columbian for cost of living, too expensive. The government's broke. This is the real underlying tension in BC right now, is that this is the first time a New Democrat government in 8 years has ever had to cut the budget. And because they're $13 billion in debt. And I think they're going to start using language that we saw from the federal Liberals. I saw this magnificent Instagram post from the Liberals in the week. It's just a masterclass in political language. Spending less, investing more. And I just thought, what a way of saying that you are hacking the hell out of a provincial budget, right? And
eating more, weighing right. less. Yeah.
So that's another tension here too, is the election platforms, the spending of past NDP governments can't be done now. And they are embracing a different philosophy of efficiency and a different tone and a different outcome. And that's completely opposite to everything that they have stood for so far. And that adds another kind of flavor and tension to it as well.
I want to close on this. I don't know BC politics well enough to know if this is true or not, but I trust my friend Paul Wells. He wrote in a column last week, and it was a very funny line. It made me laugh, but it immediately made me think I needed to talk with you, because he was writing about Paul was writing about how in general, he wasn't writing about BC specifically, but he was writing about how in general there seems to be a growing air of reality setting in among Canadian politicians, that Trump is here to stay and he means what he says, and that we're not going to escape this, that we're just going to have to deal with this now. And he had this line in it where David Eby is now routinely saying things that Danielle Smith was accused of being a traitor for saying 3 months ago. Things like, retaliatory tariffs just hurt us. It doesn't stop what's coming, or we still have to have a relationship with the Americans. So you've told me quite a bit about how Eby is still playing the Captain Canada card because it's good politics for him. Is he softening his tone on Trump, tariffs, et cetera? Like, has reality set in?
I don't think so. I think, well, the great answer to that question is going to come on the pipeline debate, which is building to a head, right? And David Eby's wrestling with that in a very public way, and he's dancing between the old and new versions of himself in real time on both sides of a fence. The guy who wants a tanker moratorium, the guy who opposes new pipelines, but then goes to premiers' meetings and stands beside Danielle Smith and says, we have to unlock our resources and get them out to different markets. And so where he lands on that, whether Danielle Smith brings a proponent to the table and if BC fights it or not, this is the guy who was the Attorney General who fought Kinder Morgan on the Trans Mountain expansion, caused it to have to be sold to the federal government. So the answer to that question is going to play out, I think, like that's a real kind of, how can you be in favor of Canadian growth, Canadian jobs, responding to Donald Trump in a unified way, and then be the lone guy kneecapping the country on a pipeline? That disconnect and that new reality is building to a head, I think, on that particular issue, and we'll have to see where he lands.
I think Trump, you've made this point well, Trump is great politics for a lot of people. It lets them change the channel, lets them talk about other things. It lets them put on the Captain Canada or Captain Europe or Captain Japan or wherever you happen to be. But sooner or later, we're going to be made an offer. And we're going to have to decide if we're in or out. And that's going to be really hard for the politicians. You know, I remember, Elbows Up Carney immediately surrendered on the digital services tax. And there could be good politics, right? There could be strategy. It could be Carney going, well, this was a Trudeau initiative. I don't really care about it. We'll throw the Americans a bone. It's very plausible. Mm-hmm. But Trump just could keep asking for stuff. And the math is eventually going to be the math. We're outnumbered 10-1. We'll cut a deal. And I just don't know, like the louder you are in the intervening period, the weirder it might be for you when the deal eventually gets signed.
That there is a part of that that's playing out in BC, I think, around softwood lumber. And the continued aggressiveness of David Eby against Trump, but then also appealing to Trump to sign, settle softwood lumber is a bit of a yin and yang that I know the Americans are kind of looking at going, if you'd like us to do a deal with you on softwood lumber, maybe stop punching us so hard. But also it's popular to punch, right? And so you end up all over the place and no one's quite sure what the right strategy is with Trump, right? And in their defense, it's not like, it's not like it makes a lot of sense. So that's a problem too.
We got lots of problems, but we always have a fun time talking. Rob, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate it. We'll check in again, and hopefully BC continues to be interesting.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me on.
Take care. That was Rob Shaw, regular contributor to The Line. You can check him out all over the place. He is often heard and read across all facets of the media in British Columbia, and we're lucky and happy to have him here at the line. My first guest, veteran pollster, my friend John Wright. Glad to have him here with me as well. We're going to be back on Friday with another episode of the Line Podcast. For now, I hope you have a great rest of the week. Stick around. We'll be back with you in 1 week, though, with Jen Gerson taking over for another episode of On the Line.